Russia and China voice support for Venezuela after Donald Trump intensifies pressure on Nicolas Maduro. The U.S. blockades sanctioned oil tankers in the midst of a major military buildup in the region. What are the dangers and what might happen next? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. Venezuela is on edge. The government of President Nicolas Maduro, those who want to see him ousted, and the country's people suffering following years of sanctions and political crises are all wondering what's next. After deploying U.S. military forces nearby, U.S. President Donald Trump has now warned that sanctioned oil tankers will be blocked from leaving Venezuela, cutting off another source of revenue. Russia and China have both reaffirmed their support for their ally. Beijing has accused the U.S. of bullying, while the Kremlin calls for restraint. Trump's new national security strategy declares the U.S. must control the entire Western Hemisphere politically, economically, and militarily. What that might mean for Venezuela has added to tensions in Caracas and the region. So where is this all headed? And how do people in Venezuela see the unfolding situation? We'll talk to our guests shortly, but first, this report from Alexandra Baez.
The United States has been escalating pressure on Venezuela for months. It tightened the screws again this week, with President Donald Trump ordering a total and complete blockade on sanctioned oil tankers entering and leaving Venezuela. He accused President Nicolas Maduro's government of using oil revenue to finance drug terrorism and of stealing oil and land from America.
Getting land, oil rights, whatever we had, they took it away because we had a president that maybe wasn't watching. But they're not going to do that. We want it back. They took our oil rights. We had a lot of oil there. As you know, they threw our companies out, and we want it back.
The blockade threatens Venezuela's crumbling economy. It has the world's largest proven oil reserves, and the U.S. is the second largest buyer after China. The U.S. buys 50% of the country's total exports, mostly crude, the government's main source of revenue. Years of economic decline have held back efforts to modernize Venezuela's armed forces. Currently, it has 123,000 active personnel and 8,000 reservists, and relies on China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba for weapons and training. Added to those is the Bolivarian militia, an estimated 300,000 armed fighters based locally throughout communities. Maduro has remained defiant, denouncing Trump's blockade as warmongering.
Today, I spoke with the UN Secretary General. We spoke at length, and I laid out to him what the scale of aggression and threats have been. So Venezuela's oil belongs to them. The Venezuelan minerals and gold belong to them. And what we've never heard before, that the Venezuelan land belongs to them and that we must give them back immediately. Honestly, it's a warlike and colonial intention.
Washington has deployed its largest presence of U.S. forces in the Caribbean in decades. More than 15,000 American soldiers, fighter jets, a Navy destroyer with guided missiles, and the world's largest aircraft carrier. Since September, it's bombed dozens of vessels in the Caribbean and Pacific, killing about 100 people it accuses of smuggling drugs. Both China and Russia have voiced support for Venezuela.
China
opposes all acts of unilateral bullying and supports countries in defending their sovereignty and national dignity. Venezuela has the right to independently develop mutually beneficial cooperation with other countries.
We see tensions escalating in the region. We see it as potentially very dangerous. Venezuela is our ally and partner. We call on all parties in the region to show restraint in order to avoid any unpredictable developments.
With each step, observers are wondering if the countries are moving closer to war. Alexandra Baez, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's now bring in our guests from Mérida in Venezuela. We're joined by Dobson, an independent journalist and political analyst, In Barcelona is Elias Ferrer, founder of Orinoco Research, a consultancy company based in Venezuela's capital, Caracas. And in Paris is Temir Porras, the managing director of Global Sovereign Advisory. He served as foreign policy advisor to Venezuela's former president, Hugo Chavez, and also as a deputy minister for foreign affairs. A warm welcome to all three of you. Thank you so much for joining us on Inside Story. Paul Dobson in Venezuela, let me start with you and get a sense of the sentiments on the ground right now. How would you describe the current mood among ordinary Venezuelans in response to the U.S. pressure and the military actions? Is there fear? Is there anger? Is there resignation or support for Nicolas Maduro?
Well, Folly, there's definitely a lot of anticipation here on the streets. Many are watching the news closely to see what will happen. Irrelevant of their political perspectives, obviously, there is a group of the population which would encourage a foreign military incursion into the country, a very small group. There is also a very small group which would be willing to take up arms to back this government and defend the country against a US intervention if that were to come. But the vast majority, in my opinion, are more concerned about the day-to-day survival here in Venezuela, are more concerned about their $1 monthly minimum wage, and are more concerned about getting food on their plate for their children than they are about these issues today.
Interesting. How resilient would you say is Maduro's political machine and security apparatus in the face of this external pressure? Do you think a civilian or military uprising, as some in the U.S. are hoping for, could succeed right now?
Well, this is a black box, basically. We're not quite sure. It's clearly as part of the U.S. strategy, trying to encourage divisions within the ruling party and the government itself. And the ruling party, since its foundation, is a multi-class party made up of a whole range of different sectors of society. And there are quite clear contradictions and differences within it. However, if this is enough to cause a fracture and for any group willing to challenge President Maduro, we're not quite sure.
All right, interesting. Temir Porras, let me come to you. The U.S. administration says the campaign on Venezuela is about stopping narcotics. Yet Trump has also openly framed it as pressure to force Maduro out. What do you think the real objective is today?
The claim that this operation or plan is to fight against drug trafficking is simply false. Any international observer, both of Venezuela, Latin America, and of the drug trafficking around the world, knows very well that Venezuela neither plays a significant role in producing any type of illegal drugs. It's a country of transit for illegal drugs, like pretty much any other country in the world, but especially because it's the neighbor of the main producer of cocaine in the world, Colombia. So Venezuela is a place of transit, but by no means is it even a producer or a hub to distribute drugs in the United States. So very clearly, this push from the Trump administration and the United States government, unilaterally, I would say, it's clearly aimed at achieving what was already attempted during the first Trump administration from 2019 onwards, when there was this recognition of a de facto parallel interim government, as it was called then.
The government of Juan Guaido.
The objective is exactly, and it's now a different, I would say, phase of the regime change policy that probably is pushed from within the Trump administration by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is very much focused on what has been his lifelong interest, which is stopping what they perceive as unfriendly left-leaning governments in Latin America, most specifically in Cuba and Venezuela. Right. And probably in achieving that goal, weakening Venezuela and achieving regime change in Venezuela is pretty much an objective that Mr. Rubio would be pushing for.
Temir, I'll ask you a little bit more about the strategy in the wider region, the American strategy in the wider region. But let me come to you, Elias, next and get your thoughts about why do you think the U.S. is going after Venezuela in this way? Is it about drugs? Is it about regime change? Or is it about Venezuela's oil and natural resources?
So there are different factors, but we can already completely eliminate the narco-terrorism or drugs countering the drug trade idea, because it just doesn't make any sense on the ground. I mean, Venezuela has nothing to do with fentanyl and is a relatively minor point for the transit of drugs towards the United States. What we can talk about is what Temir was saying before about Marco Rubio, the Cuban-American political community, and some interests that are very much in favor of regime change, not just in Venezuela, but in Cuba as well, and intervening in the region as a whole. Mm-hmm. And then we do clearly have an idea of controlling Venezuela's oil reserves in one way or another. And this is more of a long-term strategic objective, right? Because otherwise, about 80% of Venezuela's oil exports are going to China. This is mostly because of sanctions. But, there's still this idea that not just oil, but many other minerals can be found in Venezuela. Right. And, for the long term, the United States might want to control them.
And so how do you assess the economic impact of a U.S. blockade and the sanctions on Venezuela, both domestically and globally? As you mentioned, roughly 80% of Venezuela's oil exports go to China. What's going to be the impact on that? Is this also about perhaps sending a signal to China?
Well, from this 80%, we can already see that about half are transported through these sanctioned tankers, which are going to be the target of this blockade that Trump has announced. So we can already see that Venezuela's economy is likely to suffer a very severe shortage of hard currency, because about 90% of Venezuela's hard currency comes from these oil exports. So the economy will suffer as a whole. This can obviously lead to inflation, to a widening gap between the official and black market exchange rates, which will affect the purchasing power of ordinary people. And it could even cause a scarcity of many basic goods inside of Venezuela, which,
what about the consequences for the global oil market, Elias?
I mean, in this case, we're not talking about a substantial hit to the global oil market, because, Venezuela exports only about 800,000 barrels per day, which is not a big chunk of the global oil market.
Okay, interesting. Paul Dobson, let me come back to you and ask you, we've talked about the U.S. strategy and, what it is and where it's headed. What does success, you think, actually look like for the U.S. right now, as far as Venezuela is concerned, before we widen it out to the region? Is it Maduro's removal from power? Is it control over oil flows? Or is it reduced migration, as they've also portrayed it in Washington? Or is it something completely different? What does success look like for the Trump administration?
Well, I think that their objective is very clear. Donald Trump said it just this week. They want to reclaim their monopoly over the Venezuelan oil industry, lands, mines, and basic resources. Now, to get to this point, there are numerous different routes. One, which is what most are thinking of today, is about regime change. Mm-hmm. It's about overthrowing the government, putting in a more friendly government, which will instantly grant concessions to U.S. transnational corporations. However, there are other routes, which I think the U.S. government are exploring. They have successfully twisted the arm of Nicolas Maduro over the last couple of months, to the extent that Maduro, in fact, put large chunks of the Venezuelan economy on the table when he talked to Donald Trump very recently. Now, it seems that this wasn't enough for Donald Trump. He wants more. We don't know exactly the details of what Maduro offered him, but we know that it included large sectors of the Venezuelan land-based economy. So there is another route to this objective for the White House, and this is about pressuring Maduro, coercing Maduro to the point that he will put on the table what Trump wants from the Venezuelan economy. We should remember here, Folly, that this blockade, which Trump has announced, is not comparable to the blockade against Cuba. It's not a complete blockade. It's a blockade on the ships the US government wants to sanction. So the ships coming in from Chevron into Venezuelan ports will continue to come in, will continue to take Venezuelan oil back to the United States, and will continue to leave dollars in Venezuela and do trade with the Venezuelan government. This is perfectly legitimate according to this Trump policy. So this is about favoring US trade and excluding trade with the competitors of the US transnational corporations in Venezuela.
Temir, what are your thoughts about what Paul just said there? And is there a scenario, you think, in which Maduro could negotiate to stay in power while also appeasing US interests?
Well, I believe that contacts and negotiations between the Maduro and the Trump administrations have been constant. That wouldn't be anything new. On the other hand, the survival, as it is depicted, of the Venezuelan administration or President Maduro remaining in power does not depend on the United States, unless, once again, the United States want to launch a unilateral war of aggression against Venezuela.
So who does it depend
for whatever reasons they want to make. Oh, it depends. I mean, the Maduro administration has been, as it has been mentioned, for instance, facing US unilateral sanctions, because that's also something that needs to be mentioned. Venezuela as a country is not subject to international sanctions, which are normally imposed by the United Nations Security Council when a country poses a threat to the international community from the perspective of peace and security. In this case, these are unilateral economic sanctions or designations, as it is named in the United States, that basically threaten any third party from engaging in trade with certain entities in Venezuela, and that covers mostly the public sector and the national oil company. So these attempts to overthrow the regime or the government through international economic pressure have been present in Venezuela since 2017, at least, when the first financial sanctions were imposed. And they have only shown that exercising this type of pressure in the hope that there will be some sort of upheaval or fracture in the power structure is exactly the opposite that has produced.
But Temir, don't you think that there could be factions within the Venezuelan military, for example, that could be convinced to abandon Maduro in the face of these sanctions?
I think that is very unlikely in the sense that that doesn't mean that there cannot be, I would say, differences of views or even, opposed visions on how Venezuela must be ruled. But the fact of the matter is that in Latin America in general, and more importantly in Venezuela and within the Venezuelan military, the sentiment of patriotism is extremely strong. So if there was to be a challenge to the current rulers of the country, and if that challenge was to be successful, it would rather be an internal challenge, a national challenge, a Venezuelan challenge, than an imposed regime change policy coming from a foreign power, and more importantly, the United States. The Venezuelan military have a tradition, if you will, of anti-colonialism that is enshrined from their very origins. Venezuela only witnessed war 2 centuries ago, at the beginning of the 19th century, and it was during its War of Independence.
Elias,
so again, the patriotism there is very well rooted.
Temir, thank you. Let me ask Elias his thought about that. Do you agree with what Temir said there, that it's unlikely that the challenge could come from within Venezuela, not necessarily from the military, but do you think there are factions within Venezuela that could be persuaded and convinced to push out Maduro?
Well, I think that it's very clear that the majority of Venezuelans don't want to see Maduro in power, but the main problem here is that there isn't really a political structure, whether in terms of civilian political parties or in the military, that is organized enough to be able to do an uprising, to remove Maduro from power in any way. So I don't think we will see a challenge anytime soon. Otherwise, we would have seen it already, right? And actually, there have been uprisings in the past, in the last few years. And every time that they fail, they kind of strengthen Maduro's position, right? So in the end, build the military in a way that's going to be coup-proof in a way.
What about the opposition, Paul Dobson?
Well, the opposition is divided. This is the first point. There is a right-wing opposition, but there is also a left-wing opposition. At the moment, both sectors of the opposition, those on the left of Maduro and those on the right of Maduro, face extremely difficult conditions, as has been pointed out, to organize. There is wide-scale persecution of political parties, coercion of candidates. We are seeing an uptick over the last 12, 16 months in repression against those who challenge or who are even vocal on social media, on the press, against the government. One ex-presidential candidate was arrested with no right to defense, no lawyers, and was effectively disappeared for many months. And in this sort of environment, it's very, very difficult to mount a political, civil challenge to this government, which I think is why the United States are now looking to the military to try to fragment the power structure, as Temir pointed out. Last year, we had elections in Venezuela. The results have still not been published. Right. And this is one of the major causes for consternation in the Venezuelan people. And this really set the tone for this change in the civilian political structures.
All right, gentlemen, let's broaden this out a little bit and look at the wider region, because as we mentioned previously, the new U.S. national security strategy devotes quite a lot of pages to Latin America, emphasizing sovereignty for the U.S., but appearing to dismiss sovereignty for Latin American states. And we're looking at Venezuela now, but how does it fit into this new strategy and the wider region? And how do you think, Temir, Latin American governments are likely to interpret this pressure and blockade on Venezuela? Is it leadership or is it domination of the U.S.? How do you think they're likely to respond to this pressure?
Well, I believe that they are very likely to respond along the lines of their ideological affiliation, maybe sadly. On the one hand, you would have, of course, the governments of Mexico, Colombia. It's very important. Brazil, eventually, the leading progressive forces in the region that would, whilst maintaining a degree of separation from the Maduro administration, or trying to appear as at least neutral, of course, they would oppose very strongly the prospects of a military intervention in Latin America, and rightly so, because once again, given that this intervention is being promoted on the grounds of, to be honest, not very solid arguments, made up arguments about drug trafficking or even combating terrorism, that poses a regional threat. The United States could very well, and have already done it, threaten third countries, such as Colombia, for instance. President Trump said President Petro was next on the list. This is an elected president of a country that has democratic institutions. So this is a very dangerous attitude that revives the echoes of the Monroe Doctrine that says, that the United States of America must treat the rest of the continent, what they call the hemisphere, in short, Latin America, as its backyard. And that is the ground for these outrageous claims that President Trump has made on the natural resources of Venezuela.
Right.
And on the other side, you would have, of course, conservative governments that probably for other reasons will just line up with whatever the U.S. administration does.
So we're unlikely to see a unified response for now, you say, Temir. Let me come to you, Elias, and ask you about Russia and China. They have criticized the U.S. pressure. Of course, we've heard the Kremlin call for restraint. Do you think that Russia and China could use their leverage their stakes in Venezuela in order to de-escalate or complicate a U.S. intervention? How do you see them responding if the pressure was to increase further?
I think that the main way they're going to respond is just by making statements and speeches about this, because it plays into their own political rhetoric very well, right? Showing how the U.S. is aggressive and is going after all these countries in the region. and then they can say, "Oh, look, the United States is the bad guy." But I don't really see them providing any kind of material support, except for selling weaponry and some military advisors, which there's very limited support. I don't see them sending any additional troops or advanced weapon systems or anything like that to Venezuela. So, yeah, the main thing that we're going to see, and for the broader region, it plays into what they're trying to do in their own regions, right? With Russia and Ukraine, or China with Taiwan, that they can say, well, the US can do whatever it wants in Latin America, but let us do our thing in our region.
Yeah. And so, Paul, your final thoughts about this. How do you think countries in the region will respond? And do you think this could push Latin American countries, states, and closer to China rather than pulling them back towards Washington?
Well, I think Beijing and Moscow should be very concerned about this aggression. For me, it's quite clearly their interests which are in the crosshairs of this naval blockade, alongside Iranian and Turkish and Cuban trade levels. This seems clear. The US is trying to push these countries out of their backyard. And so how they manage with this, as Elias pointed out, they may try to negotiate and say, well, we'll leave, but also leave us alone in our backyard. This is possible. I think it's unlikely that they will try to escalate the situation. And I think they have to be very careful about how they handle this one.
All right. Temir, in Paris, I'll come to you last. We're seeing a military buildup, but we don't know when there's going to be an order, if there's going to be an order. What is likely to happen next, do you think? What are the likely scenarios here?
Well, I would argue that the hesitation from the Trump administration to finally unleash what they have been showing with this military mobilization in the Caribbean during the last few months comes from, on the one hand, the very clear situation of one thing is to launch a military attack on Venezuela, and the other is to achieve whatever political goals they want to achieve, regime change, but regime change with whom taking over, with which relays within the Venezuelan society, that is very unclear. And of course, on the other hand, the Trump administration was elected on a platform that advocated against endless wars and international interference. And this would necessitate the mobilization of troops on the ground. So I think that those are the major factors that are holding President Trump from finally deciding in favor of what some in his administration are advocating for. And he's probably hoping that the buildup of pressure will generate that internal fracture that, on the other hand, has not happened in the last decade. So I hope at least that the scenario of the status quo and no violence in Latin America will prevail.
All right. It'll be interesting to see what happens, how this pans out, what happens the next few weeks and next few months. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for a great discussion. Paul Dobson, Temir Porras, Elias, Ferrer. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you, too, for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye for now.